show, but there's an interesting, almost architectural element to the way the show is presented, which I'll discuss. Let me just put the PowerPoint on. So the exhibition is the last 3 decades of his life, when he went from Florence to Rome, and he lived another 30 years after he went from. He was 59 when he left Florence, and lived another 30 years. And so a lot of the preoccupation with his drawings is to do with the meditation upon death. So in 1534, Michelangelo left Florence for Rome. He was 59 years old and he never returned. So it's most closely associated with the Florentine High Renaissance. And this is one of his studies for the Last Judgment. And one of the things which I sort of wanted to pay attention to, or attention could be paid to, is the way he used drawing as a support for painting. So for the fresco process, so he worked out details or small elements and left the other elements unattended to, just sketched. So they, as it were, go in and out of focus, or they multiply in terms of points of view or angles of attention. So most of the drawing was working on the underlying composition of various figures within the painting, so had a provisional quality to them. So it dictated most of the drawing process was for this support structure and wasn't for aesthetic consumption. And the Sistine Chapel is composed out of incredible interlocking figures, so it begins to trace the transition between the High Renaissance and Mannerism. So this can be seen as the beginnings of Mannerism, where you get exaggerated human form, elongation, and emotional intensity. So there's a staging of two ends in this exhibition: the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of Mannerism, a sort of trans-historical feeling, and the end of, literally the end of the death of the artist. So the Last Judgment had the highly stylized groupings of figures which all required both overall spatial planning but an array of gestural configurations. So a sort of exaggeration of expression. So this is again studies of the Last Judgment. And you can see he just attends to various groupings and then various figures. So there's no feeling of the drawing being composed in itself. It's very much a schematic process of using drawing. Incredible detail with general features. This is a massive drawing. It's composed of 6 sheets of large scale paper. It's hung in the British Museum generally, but it's been, I think, taken out of the collection and restored for the show. And it's absolutely massive. It's one of the only surviving drawings on this scale and cartoon. And it was left in his studio when he died. So it wasn't for collection. It wasn't for a collector. It was for a study for a painting. Often these drawings would be marked by pinholes and charcoal dust would be scattered to leave the drawing outline on the canvas or the fresco. So he became increasingly concerned with his own mortality, and he did a whole series of drawings of Christ's crucifixion, meditating on his approaching death. So this is one of the Christ on the cross. Now, there's a sort of very strange thing which happens in the exhibition, in that they exhibit these drawings in a circular black room, very subdued lighting. So it's completely black and circular. But these drawings are very much apart from his general practice of using drawings. They have an internal meditation process within them. You can see the skull at the base of the crucifix. But there's something like 12 drawings. And I think the staging of them in a circle shows that they're a trans-historical or a sign of late work. And this is the last sculpture that was working on at his time of his death. Completely distressed. It's almost impossible to redeem, but yet it's seen as almost a modernist work. So it had a kind of strange futurity to it. But it's a really interesting show, raises some interesting questions. And the drawings of a staggering quality, really quite something. I mean, if there's interest, we can raise another visit. There's also some interesting architectural drawings.
Jonathan, I have a question about you just mentioned in the presentation that this exhibition shows end of Renaissance and at the beginning of the Mannerism.
Yeah.
Where do you see that the overlap?
Well, the overlaps in the Last Judgment.
In subject manner or in skill manner?
Not in subject matter, but in execution. So, I mean, because he lived for so long, I mean, Raphael died in his 30s, I think, and Leonardo in his 60s, so he lived 30 years beyond um, his immediate contemporaries. He despised Raphael.
Why?
Um, but the three great artists of the Renaissance, Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, all shared a very intense relationship to drawing. But I was interested in the show between this idea of the end of a period, transition, and the idea of meditation upon death, your own death.
Jonathan, I was wondering if what the reason for his move might have been, if it was political exile, or was there some sort of turbulence, as there often was?
I think he was commissioned.
Mm.
I mean, did the Sistine Chapel.
Mm-hmm.
But he became increasingly old and distressed, and in a way argumentative. He fell out with a lot of the commissioning, and he was working on his own theological schema, as it were. He didn't just take, he wasn't subservient to his commissions. But I thought we'd just focus a little bit on that, because we've been to see quite a few drawing shows now. And as I've been saying, I think there's a focus on drawing. There's an audience for drawing that it was in the past very patchy.
And in terms of your what you've said a bit about drawing, in terms of the maybe sort of a distinction between a public and a private, in his own lifetime, were these drawings viewed widely, or was it purely personal, or maybe himself and
Well, they were
a few
used for
friends?
projects. So they were studio, they were part of his studio. They were not, it wasn't a market. I mean, you would tend to give a drawing away or do a drawing for somebody. Or in the later stage of his life, use it as a meditative process. And I think that series of drawings of the crucifixions are really great works in themselves. So they show the autonomy of drawing, display the autonomy of drawing. Anyway, unless it's something else, we can go into the Rancierre text. Are there any other questions? Okay. I don't know how we'll do this. I'll just say a few words about Rancierre. Rancierre first came to notice, he worked on Reading Capital by Jacques. I mean, it was under the auspices of a seminar by Althusser, gathered together 5 or 6 intellectuals to discuss the structure of Marx's Das Kapital, which is in 3 volumes. And the thesis was that there were two different sorts of Marx: the early Marx, the philosophical humanist Marx, the Marx who was influenced overly by the dialectical schema of Hegel, and the late Marx who was influenced by Spinoza and monism, and it was the late Marx that they were privileging, what they almost term the scientific Marx. So you have this contrast between the humanist Marx and scientific Marxism. And this started a whole process of, it was under the auspices of structuralism, but it started the idea of deep reading. And there's an interesting footnote. There were a lot of reading groups in London in the early 70s focused on looking at the idea of a deep reading of a text. So there were study groups on Althusser's Reading Capital and Lacan. So a lot of feminists were interested in Althusser and then Lacan. Artists like Mary Kelly and filmmakers. So he was associated with that. Then he became much more interested in the idea of aesthetics and the relationship between politics and aesthetics. So he has this idea of distribution of the sensible. But he's mainly interested in the idea of democracy and distribution, and one of his most popular books or essays is The Emancipated Spectator. But I guess what we could do is read a part of it, unless anyone's done a reading and would like to do a commentary. Has anyone done a reading?
I've done a reading, and I mean, but that's what I did last time, because when I read, I always annotate. So I mean, I could read my annotations if that.
Can you do that? Because it would be, I think it would be a bit grueling to do the whole, read it all literally.
Okay, so it's on my iPad at the moment, so I don't think I can share the screen with it. So I'll just read it. So from page on the.
I'll pick it out with my arrow.
Okay, so starting at the beginning, so I call the distribution of the sensible the system of self-evident facts of sense perception that simultaneously discloses the existence of something in common and the delimitations that define the respective parts and positions within it. A distribution of the sensible therefore establishes at one and the same time something common that is shared and exclusive parts. Then I go down towards the bottom of that page. They cannot be somewhere else because work will not wait. The distribution of the sensible reveals who can have a share in what is common to the community based on what they do and on the time and space in which this activity is performed. Having a particular occupation thereby determines the ability or inability to take charge of what is common to the community. And this is what I thought was important, it defines what is visible or not in a common space. This is going to the next page. Endowed with a common language, etc. There is thus an aesthetics at the core of politics that has nothing to do with Benjamin's discussion of the aestheticization of politics specific to the age of the masses. So I think that kind of sets it out. Then I go to page 14, the next page. First paragraph, halfway down. In sum, Plato singles out three ways in which discursive and bodily practices suggest forms of community. The surface of mute signs that are, he says, like paintings, and the space of bodily movement that divides itself into two antagonistic models, the movement of the simulacra on the stage that is offered as material for the audience's identifications and, on the other hand, the authentic movement characteristic of communal bodies. Then I had this highlighted as important on the next page, 15, last paragraph. Modernist discourse presents the revolution of pictorial abstraction as painting's discovery of its own proper medium, two-dimensional surface. By revoking the perspectivist illusion of the third dimension, painting was to regain the mastery of its own proper surface. In actual fact, however, this surface does not have any distinctive feature. A surface is not simply a geometric composition of lines, it is a certain distribution of the sensible. And then going on to the next page, 16 and 17 at the top, one line, the reproduction of optical depth was linked to the privilege according to the story. And then jumping down in the same paragraph, classical poetics established a relationship of correspondence at a distance between speech and painting, between the sayable and visible, which gave imitations its own specific space. In this relationship, that is at stake in the supposed distinction between two-dimensional and three-dimensional space as specific to a particular form of art. And then I jumped on quite a bit to page 18, down at the bottom, just one line. The important thing is that the question of the relationship between aesthetics and politics be raised at this level, the level of the sensible delimitation of what is common to the community, the forms of its visibility and its organization. Then I go to the next chapter in there, and then the introduction there. Certain of the most fundamental categories used for thinking about artistic creation in the 20th century, namely the categories of modernity, the avant-garde, and for some time now, postmodernity, also happen to have a political meaning. Do these categories seem to you to have the slightest interest for conceiving, in precise terms, what ties aesthetics to politics? So that's on page 20, and then a little bit further down. With regard to what we call art, it is in fact possible to distinguish within the Western tradition three major regimes of identification. This is, first of all, what I propose to call an ethical regime of images. In this regime, art is not identified as such, but is subsumed under the question of images. And then the next page near the top. Plato does not, this is page 21, so back one. Back a page, yeah. So up at the top there, very near the top, Plato does not, as is often claimed, place art under the yoke of politics. And then kind of last paragraph of that page, the poetic or representative regime of the arts breaks away from the ethical regime of images. It identifies the substance of art, or rather of the arts, in the couple poiesis mimesis. The mimetic principle is not at its core a normative principle stating that art must make copies resembling their models. It is first of all a pragmatic principle that isolates, within the general domain of the arts, ways of doing and making, certain particular forms of art that produce specific entities called imitations. Then I went to the next page, page 22 and 23, first full paragraph. I call this regime poetic in the sense that it identifies the arts, what the classical age would later call the fine arts, within a classification of ways of doing and making, and it consequently defines proper ways of doing and making as well as means of assembling imitations. I call it representative insofar as it is the notion of representation or mimesis that organizes these ways of doing, making, seeing, and judging. Then going down to the last paragraph of the page, the aesthetic of that same page, the aesthetic regime of the arts stands in contrast with the representative regime. I call this regime aesthetic because the identification of art no longer occurs via a division between the ways of doing and making, but is based on distinguishing a sensible mode of being specific to artistic products. Then skipping a little bit that same page, last one, in the aesthetic regime, artistic phenomena are identified by their adherence to a specific regime of the sensible. This is going on to the next page, which is extricated from its ordinary connections and is inhabited by a heterogeneous power, the power of form of thought that has become foreign to itself, a product identical with something not produced, knowledge transformed into non-knowledge, logos identical with pathos, the intention of the unintentional, etc. And then the last paragraph, that same page, it is pointless to go on with definitions and examples. We need to indicate, on the contrary, the heart of the problem. The aesthetic regime of the arts is the regime that strictly identifies art in the singular and frees it from any specific rule, from any hierarchy of the arts, subject matter, and genres. Yet it does so by destroying the mimetic barrier that distinguished ways of doing and making affiliated with art from other ways of doing and making, a barrier that separated its rules from the order of social occupations. Then going to the next page, 24 and 25, first paragraph. From this perspective, it is possible to understand the function served by the notion of modernity. The aesthetic regime of the arts, it can be said, is the true name for what is designated by the incoherent label modernity. Then skipping to the next page near the top, the aesthetic regime of the arts did not begin with decisions to initiate an artistic rupture. It began with decisions to reinterpret what makes art or what art makes. And then going to the next page, 26, at the beginning of the top, I have this highlighted as important. The idea of modernity would like there to be only one meaning and direction in history, whereas the temporality specific to the aesthetic regime of the arts is a co-presence of heterogeneous temporalities.
That's very important.
Yeah. The notion of modernity thus seems to have been deliberately invented to prevent a clear understanding of the transformation of art and its relationship with other spheres of collective experience. Then I go halfway down the page on 27, the next page over. The idea of modernity as a time devoted to the material realization of a humanity still latent in mankind was constructed on this foundation. It can be said regarding this point that the aesthetic revolution produced a new idea of political revolution, the material realization of a common humanity still only as existing as an idea. And then I skipped over to the next page, 28 and 29, first paragraph. What is called postmodernism is really the process of this reversal. At first, postmodernism brought to light everything in the recent evolution of the arts and possible ways of thinking the arts that destroyed modernism's theoretical edifice. Then going down the page a little bit, the teleological modern model of modernity became untenable at the same time as its divisions between the distinctive features of the different arts or the separation of a pure domain of art. Postmodernism, in a sense, was simply the name under whose guise certain artisan thinkers realized that what modernism had been, a desperate attempt to establish a distinctive feature of art by linking it to a simple teleology of historical evolution and rupture. Then going to the next page, and I had page 29, the same pair at the top. I had this highlighted as important. Modernist faith had latched on to the idea of the aesthetic education of man that Schiller had extracted from the Kantian analytic of the beautiful. The postmodern reversal had as its theoretical foundation Lyotard's analysis of the Kantian sublime, which was reinterpreted as the scene of a founding distance separating the idea from any sensible presentation. From this moment onward, postmodernism came into harmony with the mourning and repenting of modernatist thought, and the scene of the sublime distance came to epitomize all sorts of scenes of original distance or original sin. The Heideggerian flight of the gods, the irreducible aspect of the unsymbolizable object, and the death drive as analyzed by Freud, the voice of the absolutely other declaring a ban on representation, the revolutionary murder of the father. Postmodernism thus became the grand threnody of the unpresentable, intractable, irredeemable, denouncing the modern madness of the idea of a self-emancipation of mankind's humanity and its inevitable and interminable culmination in the death camps. It's quite a jump there. And I think that was kind of the point that Catherine Malibu made when she talked to us a year or two ago. And then moving on, just page 31, just a little bit, halfway down. The persistent success of Benjamin's thesis on art in the age of mechanical reproduction is, moreover, undoubtedly due to the crossing over they allow for between the categories of Marxist material explanation and those of Heideggerian ontology, which ascribe the age of modernity to the unfurling of the essence of technology. And then going to the next page, 42 and 43, partway down 43. Hence, artistic practice is not the outside of work, but is displaced form of visibility. The democratic distribution of the sensible makes the worker into a double being. It removes the artisan from his place, the domestic space of work, and gives him time to occupy the space of public discussions and take on the identity of a deliberative citizen. The mimetic act of splitting in two, which is at work in theatrical space, consecrates this duality and makes it visible. The exclusion of the mimetician from the Platonic point of view goes hand in hand with the formation of a community where work is in its place. And on next page, 44 and 45, halfway down in the first paragraph, Romanticism declared that the becoming sensible of all thought and the becoming thought of all sensible materiality was the very goal of the activity of thought in general. In this way, art once again became a symbol of work. It anticipates the end, the elimination of oppositions, that work is not yet in a position to attain for itself and for itself. However, it does this insofar as it is a production, the identification of a process of material execution with a community's self-presentation of meaning. Then I went down to the last couple of sentences on page 45. The cult of art presupposes a revalorization of the abilities attached to the very idea of work. However, this idea is less the discovery of the essence of human activity than a recomposition of the landscape of the visible, a recomposition of the relationship between doing, making, being, seeing, and saying. Whatever might be the specific types of economic circuits they lie within, artistic practices are not exceptions to other practices. They represent and reconfigure the distribution of these activities. And moving on a couple of pages to page 51. And then at the very bottom, concerning art, it seemed necessary to me to emphasize the existence of historical regimes of identification in order to dismiss at one and the same time the false obviousness of art's existence and the confused image of artistic modernity in terms of a critique of representation. That's going to the next page on 52. I evoke the fact that art in the singular has only existed for 2 centuries, and this existence in the singular meant the upheaval of the coordinates through which the fine arts had been located up until then, as well as the disruption of the norms of fabrication and assessment that these coordinates presuppose. Then at the bottom of the page, that said, art as we know it in the aesthetic regime is the implementation of a certain equality. It is based on the destruction of the hierarchical system of the fine arts. And then going to page 54, halfway down the first paragraph, what functions differently is the relationship between saying and meaning. This is where a dividing line becomes visible, which coincides with the implementation of another form of equality, not the equality of communicators, but the equality of the communicated. Likewise, for abstract painting to appear, it is first necessary that the subject matter of painting be considered a matter of indifference. This began with the idea that painting a cook with her kitchen utensils was as noble as painting a general on a battlefield. In literature, it began with the idea that it was not necessary to adopt a particular style to write about nobles, bourgeois, peasants, princes, or valets. The equality of subject matter and the indifference regarding modes of expression is prior to the possibility of abandoning all subject matter for abstraction. The former is the condition of the latter. And then going several pages to page 63. It is the dream of an art, and almost at the bottom of page 63, it is the dream of an art that would transmit meanings in the form of a rupture with the very logic of meaningful situations. As a matter of fact, political art cannot work in the simple form of a meaningful spectacle that would lead to an awareness of the state of the world. Suitable political art would ensure, at one and the same time, the production of a double effect: the readability of a political signification and a sensible or perceptual shock caused, conversely, by the uncanny, by that which resists signification. In fact, this ideal effect is always the object of a negotiation between opposites, between the readability of the message that threatens to destroy the sensible form of art and the radical uncanniness that threatens to destroy all political meaning. That's the end of my highlighting.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thanks so much, Lester.
It's a
great.
pleasure. I might have picked out the wrong bits, but those were the bits that stuck out to me. But I thought it was interesting just the connection between aesthetics and politics. And I guess, as you say, Jonathan, that others have, you can see why others have bounced off of that. How the politics and societal systems can influence perception, and I guess what Rancierre is kind of, the structure of society allows what can be said.
So, is there anything which sticks out? Anyone would like to focus on a particular?
Could I just add one other section that stood out to me when I read it on just a sentence on page 19. It says the arts own 19. Yeah. The arts only ever lend to projects of domination or emancipation what they are able to lend to them. That is to say, quite simply, what they have in common with them: bodily positions and movements, functions of speech, the parceling out of the visible and the invisible. Furthermore, the autonomy that they can enjoy, or the subversion they claim credit for, rests on the same foundation.
Why did you pick that out?
That's it. I just, when I was reading it earlier, it took me a while to kind of work out what he was saying in terms of a kind of sensitive critique of art or the applied arts, as he was saying, whether it was analogous to a kind of socio-political critique, or whether what kind of relationship that it had between them. And this seemed to me to say kind of quite succinctly the limitations of it, but also the value of it.
And what were the other features of the relationship between politics and aesthetics that you attended to?
I'm not sure I'd be able to give you any good examples, really.
I guess you could almost argue it in reverse, that if aesthetics can disrupt how you perceive, so it could disrupt politics. I guess if you work it from the other direction, as you say, politics can affect perception and art.
Let's begin with Plato. What was Plato's stance on art?
Was that what he called the ethical regime, where art is judged on its moral implications?
Why did Plato call for the banning of poets?
I would just guess, and maybe they would sway the common person.
There was something I think in the text suggesting that Plato in the Republic suggested that through their sort of mimicry, poets are kind of duplicitous, that they are pretending to be something, and therefore they are not fulfilling their proper role as workers in that society. And maybe that is also linked to what you're saying, Lester, and that they sort of lead people astray by displacing work.
In that they're dangerous, aren't they, in Plato?
Isn't it sort of similar reason Socrates was also criticized, leading the youth into, yes, astray sort of thing.
Yeah, he got killed for that, or had to
Commit
trick the
suicide.
hemlock.
So that establishes a very fraught relationship between the demos or the forum. What do you pick up as his disavowal of Benjamin, Walter Benjamin, who knows the argument in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction? Who's read that?
I have. I guess that it's that mechanical reproduction, as Benjamin saw it, means that a work of art would lose its aura.
And was that a good or bad thing?
I think to Benjamin, I think that was a bad thing. Unless you know, some artists have come at it from the point of view, use mechanical reproduction to create works of art that have an aura, but that's a different argument.
But he saw the age of mass reproduction as a potential democratization process. He wasn't disavowing this age. The stripping of aura.
Again, was it a good thing or bad thing, or is it just observation of what's happening? This age of mass reproduction thing,
He saw
according to Benjamin.
He saw it as a potential good thing. And we were talking about new forms of theatre, new forms of film and print. So he saw it as fulfilling a democratic function and a modernizing function.
So it was a good thing for Benjamin then, you think, the mechanical
Yeah.
reproduction? Oh, so I got that 180 degrees wrong. So he wasn't
Just
concerned.
wanted.
Sorry, Yonyi.
Go ahead, Lester, and I will put some example.
You go ahead.
Well, this Sunday I went to somebody's place. Someone I met at the art function. This person is a New Zealand collector of contemporary New Zealand art. And his place in a place called Cabin has ground floor, upstairs, lounge, kitchen, dining, bedrooms, and hallway, full of artwork everywhere. Be like the scene from the final offer with Jeffrey Archer when he has a wall of all the works that he got from the auction thing. Anyway, he was suggesting if I wanted to start collection, that I should start with something like, say, say, Mark Lester, collectible. This Mark Lester guy, not real name, is the gallery operator who has a series of 12 reprints of well-known New Zealand artists called Rita Angus, Don Bini, Mark Hotere, those couple of names. Think about something like Western art, Picasso and Renoir and all those things. He has a series of 12 reprints and said it for something like $35 per piece. And then it's a good way of start collecting, not the original, but get yourself used to. And I was in two minds. I wasn't sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Good in a way that public can be close to well-known artwork with a very small amount, but bad in a way it diminished the importance of the authenticity. So I just want to throw it into the discussion or thinking point.
Are there any other sort of, so we've looked at this is a short discussion on Plato and then Benjamin. What's his argument about mimesis? What is a mimetic?
That be under representational art, that it's mimesis?
Yeah, I think very broadly.
I mean, from what I remember, he sort of moves on to some extent to talk about Aristotle and poetics when he's talking about mimesis. And Aristotle in his poetics is much more forgiving than Plato. So Plato himself is quite poetic, I think, you know, the kind of metaphor of the caves and things. He certainly uses it. Yeah, so my sort of understanding is that Rancierre is it's tracking between different thinkers, while at the same time presenting this idea of the aesthetic mode or the distribution of the sensible idea. He's kind of tracking the different as being a kind of an emergent quality of artworks of the last couple of hundred years. He's also using that as a sort of theoretical lens through which to look through these things of the past. So, you know, we looked at Plato, and then he looks at Aristotle and this idea of kind of hierarchy, both hierarchies of different kind of types of craft, and then within those crafts, hierarchies of competence based on their kind of effective ability to mimic the qualities of or the designated qualities of that specific art form. And so he kind of, I might be just imagining or kind of extrapolating or making up, but that sort of takes on a more kind of, you know, if Plato has a sort of a flat, but a sort of quite an ugly version of society because it's a sort of a democracy based on slavery. Aristotle seems to have moved into more of a sort of aristocratic kind of a hierarchy of artworks, which kind of and competences within those different crafts, which mimics maybe the more sort of aristocratic sort of strata of nobility that Aristotle was kind of inhabiting with Alexander and things. So mimicry becomes a key structuring form through which hierarchies can be assessed and mapped against each other.
He also, I mean, it's very important in relation to Kant in that he introduced categories and the privileged imagination in a way which Kant revived. So it's very important for Kant. What was his relationship to Alexander?
Aristotle?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, this isn't in the text, I don't think, but Aristotle, the simple answer is that Aristotle was Alexander's tutor, but before that, Philip of Macedonia, Alexander the Great's father, had completely annihilated and decimated and completely eviscerated, to the extent that there was no evidence of its even existence, Aristotle's hometown in northern Greece during one of the Macedonian campaigns. So Aristotle was in Athens as a young student at that time, and his entire world was completely obliterated. But then later, he was this brilliant student at Plato's school. And the school that Plato set up. And he was then recruited to be the tutor to the very young, well, I think he was a teenager at the time, young son of the tyrant who had completely obliterated his own home. So I think there's something kind of, really interesting. And then Aristotle travelled with Alexander on the campaigns. I suppose maybe, if you're being sympathetic, which I would be, he was maybe, trying to humanise and redeem almost, while also survive with the son of the person who destroyed his family, friends, and life.
He says something very interesting. Aristotle said to Alexander, when you go to India, if you get to India, seek out those holy men who are perhaps yogis, and ask them the question, what is the nature of being? And when Alexander got to India, he got his gods to go and find a yogi, and they found some bedraggled yogis and took them to the camp of Alexander, and he asked the question and they didn't answer. And he said, why aren't you answering? And eventually one of them says, all those who, he said, what constitutes wisdom in beings? And he said, wisdom in beings is all those that avoid the naming of man or wise beings. So in a way, it inaugurated the idea that as soon as you're named, you're under danger of elimination or political power. It's a rather interesting moment. So certain negativity in defining wisdom in human beings. It doesn't really refer to Marx. Why do you think that is? What's his argument about modernity? What's his main argument about modernity?
That it was
I mean, one of the
that it was
things
teleological.
he says that there's not one form of, he questions the existence of the modernity or a single modernity. What else does he say about modernity?
He says yeah, I mean, in terms of also what, why doesn't he talk too much about Marx? Right? Clearly, it is very Marxist, but I suppose he would point out that Marx was utopian in the sense that he believed in the positivity of some kind of form of progress, and Rancierre says that is the delusion of modernity. In his discussion of the postmodern, as I understood it.
So what does it say about postmodern? There were quite a few quotes read out about postmodernity.
I mean, I felt that there was a union, maybe in his sort of politics of the aesthetic and the postmodern, in that, if I sort of understood it correctly, his idea of the kind of the aesthetic mode is that in order to, or like one way of thinking about or creating art is to think of it not as a sort of an ordering of symbols, a sort of reconciliation of a narrative through an ordering of symbols, but rather than a reordering of symbols to present a perceived truthful narrative, a reconfiguration of symbols as a kind of reflection of the political structure that underpins one's moment. So in terms of that, I kind of thought that, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I was kind of interested in that very question, like where do we go after the postmodern? I felt that this piece has been written from within that lens. So I felt he was kind of like very much in sort of favour of the postmodern, and thought that was sort of the lens through which we should now be making and thinking about art.
It does correspond to that period. It's approximately from 79 to mid-90s. Has anyone seen any other point they'd like to bring up?
Jonathan, what can I just ask? This wasn't in the text. I listened to a little bit of an interview with him, and do you know what it was that he fell out with Althusser about in terms of the legacy of '68? What was the big difference of opinion there?
Althusser was in the Communist Party, and there was a kind of divide between the student movement, which was made up of a mixture of anarchists, Trotskyites, Maoists, Democrats, and the organised labour, which was under the auspices mainly of the Communist Party, which tended to put a brake on the demand for revolution. So I think he took a more libertarian view of the May '68 than Althusser. Which it was very much around the arguments that it wasn't ready for revolution. You should negotiate with the ruling authorities. It was probably the communist parties. I mean, it's very fractious, the relationship between the Communist Party and the other revolutionary movement, which tend to be much more organization around group skills or smaller cells. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs, but I imagine that's the heart of it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I remember what I remember, he said that Althusser thought that nothing of consequence really came from 68, whereas he thought that actually quite a lot had done. And I think probably in relation to aesthetics as well.
It defined also post-structuralism. So post-structuralists were more emancipatories and I mean went beyond all political regimes.
I mean, I'd be.
Sorry.
I don't want to interrupt. I was just wondering if we, you know, as clearly brilliant a text as it is, if we wanted to kind of think about a critique, you know, I'm wondering whether he doesn't talk. I mean, he doesn't talk about. This is, you know, the Marx thing. He doesn't talk about capital with a small c, or money, or art markets, and maybe, you know, that was a different time and there were different kind of arguments that he was having. But I suppose there's this kind of strange mix, as I felt in the text, between a kind of, you could say, a ethical nihilism, which is that the politics of one's day will manifest in the art of one's day, and a kind of, on the other hand, a sort of like kind of gesture towards the utopianism of democracy and, or kind of the democratization of the kind of artistic creative process. But, you know, I don't know, maybe not much engagement with, in a way, the challenge that Plato kind of raised right at the beginning, which is, you know, how does someone have the resources to support themselves and make art in a world in which the vast majority of people have to work to survive? And maybe that's not, maybe that's a completely different conversation, but within a text about politics of aesthetics, and in terms of distribution of the sensible, is it enough just to think about the sensible? What about the resources that are required to have access to wonderful museum visits, or you know, spending time making work? Does anyone else sort of feel that was that's a legitimate critique, or is that a different kind of
I think
question, maybe?
idea of apparatus, wouldn't it? Art as an apparatus.
Yeah, I think I felt something similar, and particularly when he was talking about Madame Bovary being, an example of a kind of a sort of democratic text in its, in its reflection and non-hierarchical way of being written, and kind of loosely being a kind of critique of bourgeois life, but it felt a little bit like, I don't really know how to describe it. It just felt a little disconnected or something.
Is he indicating that political art is in a balance? Page 30, he's talking about aesthetics. He's talking about two kinds of avant-garde and the politics of the aesthetics. On page 30. And he's talking about because the way I understand it, there's sort of art has to find itself in a kind of in-between situation. And when he's talking about what is believed to have brought to it by transforming politics into a total life program, the history of the relations between political parties and aesthetic movements is first of all the history of a confusion, but he does talk about the two different kinds and how they sort of interact. He describes the aesthetic what the aesthetic avant-garde brings to the political avant-garde. And so
Shall we just read that section? The history of relations between political parties. Did you read that? So read that section.
where are you starting from?
History of relations between political parties and aesthetic movements is first of all a history of confusion.
On page 29, or is it
30?
30. Oh, okay. The history of the relations between political parties and aesthetic movements is first of all the history of a confusion, sometimes complacently maintained, at other times violently denounced, between these two ideas of the avant-garde, which are in fact two different ideas of political subjectivity. The archepolitical idea of a party, that is to say, the idea of a form of political intelligence that sums up the essential conditions for change, and the metapolitical idea of global political subjectivity, the idea of the potentially inherent in the innovative, sensible modes of experience that anticipate a community to come. I have some questions about. It's quite difficult to get to grips with some ideas because he talks about community, but he doesn't. Does he give a definition for community? What is community to him? What is this a closed group of people, or is it everyone who wants to join, or does it change? And he talks about distribution. The thing is, it's a translation, isn't it, from French? So what does he mean by distribution? Because distribution can mean a sharing out. So I'm confused about, yeah, because sharing out means a closed space as well. So is he talking about, like, so, but the imagination in art doesn't belong within a closure. Anyway, what I'm getting from him is that there's there's a balance somehow, and this can subvert a closure because if it's in a balance, the balance is shifting. The balance will shift and not remain static. So that sort of doesn't allow a closure. But as you can see, I'm kind of in a confusion about what he's getting at because I don't understand his terms.
But in fact, the last sentence, it is rather the very idea of political avant-garde is divided between the strategic conception and the aesthetic conception of the avant-garde. So it's privileging the political avant-garde as having being a strategic conception of things, whereas the aesthetic, as opposed to the aesthetic conception of the avant-garde, which isn't strategic. It facilitates the distribution of the sensible, I guess.
But distribution, again, it connects to capitalism. So this connects to some of the other conversation I had started. I guess I kind of disrupted, but I thought that is distribution and capitalism go together very closely. The idea of, and postmodernity sort of sort of horizontal procedure of distribution, trying to distributing the goods. But I feel that that isn't what Rancierre is getting at in his term distribution. I need to.
I mean, it's the basis of the democratic, isn't it?
Yeah, democracy is open-ended, but capitalism isn't so much.
So you get within capitalism a form of democracy.
But not open-ended.
Not open-ended.
So it's not to do with freedom.
Well, it's restrictive.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes right back to Aristotle to define human beings speaking entities, thus having a democratic impulse, a sharing out. If it be a sharing out, there's got to be a distribution of forms.
If it's sharing out, there has to be a mechanism for doing that, or a system. So it comes down to sort of some kind of choice, some kind of something organizing, some kind of hierarchical structure.
Any final points?
So Jonathan, what would I think is Rancière saying that there's an enhanced role of the viewer in all this, that there's more participation, so as opposed to the viewer being passive?
Yeah, he writes an essay called The Emancipated Spectator, which he argues for an enhanced role of spectator in art as a defining feature of the art form.
How would that, would there be any difference from his view on that versus somebody like Robert Morris and, his work in the 1960s?
I mean, he's got a much more structuralist starting point, Rancierre. I mean, Robert Morris would be much more libertarian and anarchist. I mean, structuralism argued for the death of the subject, death of the author.
Comes the birth of the reader. Usually, death of the author and birth of the reader goes hand in hand, I believe.
Let's leave it there. Has there been any shows which you've been to see recently? We did a visit to the Expressionist show. It was about 10 of us. And also went to see the Yoko Ono show, which had some interesting points to it. And there's a show on Cork Street of Guy Brett's collection, which mainly is focused on Signals Gallery, which was between 64 and 66. A particularly good selection of work by Leisure Clark, the Brazilian artist who emerged in the 60s and defined the idea of participation art. We could review one of those three shows. I've got a text on each of them. So Yoko Ono, Guy Brett, and Signals Gallery and Expressionism. Which should we review?
I guess I would vote for Guy Brett and Lygia Clark and all of that. But that's just me.
Anyone else got a Guy Brett, Leisure Clark? Okay, so seeing as you don't want to volunteer choice, you get the.
Hey, Jonathan, are we going to do that right now? Because I was going to have a small presentation of my recent work.
Okay, I'll just do 10 minutes and then you do the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Visions out my images disappear off my text for some reason. I put them on and they disappear. I must have pressed a button somewhere. So Signals Gallery was between 64 and 66. And it had a newsletter. Instead of catalogues of artists' work, it had a newsletter, which has become very influential. It drew together artists from Latin America, Asia, and Europe. And it could be described as a project. So it not only mixed artists from 3 different continents, it was also related to the advent of kinetic art, which also gave rise to participation art and auto-destructive art. It's also interesting that it was very close to counterculture manifestations and forms of politics that resisted different forms of dictatorship. So, for instance, Ali Ortega and Leisure Clark had ways of thinking about the dictatorship in Brazil and developing forms which could subvert the restrictive movement of people. So the idea of participation was a kind of way of politically getting around dictatorship. The newsletter cited figures like Gaston Bachelard, Gregory Bateson, pre-Socratic philosophy, Spinoza, Indian Tantrism, Zen, Bergson, and Wilhelm Reich were all thrown into a heady mix, which, I mean, on the one side were post-existential but pre-situationists, a kind of hip radicalism. Over the period of the subsequent duration, signals, galleries, and art world event has attracted serious and sustained commentary. And particularly, it is the forerunner, in many ways, of relation aesthetics. And some of the figures have become, 50 years later, very important. Leisure Clark, Leisure Pape, and Eleanor Tasika. There's some wonderful matchbox sculptures by Leisure Clark from '64, and some wonderful drawings by Mira Shadell, monotypes. One figure who's not in the collection is David Medalla, but he was very closely associated with Guy Brett. I'll leave it there, but it's a show. It's on Cork Street, just behind the Royal Academy. It's worth seeing if you're interested in that period and interested in a kind of sort of something which resisted pop art and minimal art as an aesthetic mainstream. But it's very much come to the fore recently. So if we could have the presentation now.
Thank you. Let's see. Share screen. First, a short video